Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and we've got a high-powered Tuvasa the Sunlit Enchantress deck. This deck comes to us from JD Fane, who says, overall I aim for this deck to be high-powered but not CEDH. As for now, it seems to work fairly well, but can sometimes feel clunky in the early game. And they add that there is a primer for more general information on the deck. And as for any deck building restrictions, they say no budget really. Can't afford $1,000 cards though. Don't worry, we will not be suggesting anything of that cost. So, as always, the deck list will be in the video description below, and I highly recommend you take a look at it, especially this deck. This is a very, very strong deck, and it's been built very, very well. I am a big fan of this deck. I have more minute and kind of direct criticisms for it, which I can hope to make it stronger. And but even beyond those, I think this is the kind of deck that I would completely sleeve myself and bring to a weekly commander game of similar powered decks. I think it does exactly what it does very, very powerfully, and I think it is a great baseline to start with if you're looking to make a high-powered Enchantress deck. So, who is Tuvasa and what is the purpose of the deck? Well, Tuvasa is an Enchantress type creature, a 3 mana in Bant, Merfolk Shaman at a 1/1. It gets an additional point of power and toughness for each enchantment you control, and the first enchantment you cast each turn draws you a card, which is what makes, I believe, her an Enchantress. I could be wrong, but well, Enchantress implies. Anyways, let's keep going. So, purpose of this deck is to have as many Enchantress effects, which draw you a card per cast or when an enchantment enters the battlefield, and then you're going to play a lot of disruptive or powerful enchantments, hoping to go for a combo finish. Now we can scroll down here and briefly take a look at the curve. What is 10 mana? Omniscience, right? But the curve itself is really, really nice. Once again, this deck is built really, really well, and so we're in a pretty good spot to start looking at it and seeing what we can change. Now, something that's kind of worth noting is Tuvasa is maybe not the strongest option because one can argue that Sithis is just stronger. However, Tuvasa comes with an additional color, which I agree is worth playing her over Sithis. We are going to be using that blue mana, and therefore we're purposely taking a underpowered, maybe not underpowered, but lower power commander than one of the options in order to increase our card pool. This is a great decision. Also, for what it's worth, is that Tuvasa does grow. That's something that Sithis doesn't do, but I think that's kind of a minimal thing, but it will come up again later. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about is the deck itself and its play pattern. Now, one of the problems with a deck like this at this power level is that enchantment decks tend to a certain extent, react to the meta they are in. Because enchantments, there are a bunch of really strong ones, but there are not a lot of like universally powerful enchantments. And by that, I mean defensively. So, for example, Smothering Tithe is really, really good, but the power of a card such as Rest in Peace, Stony Silence, which are just generally good, sure. But let's look at Darksteel Mutation. Darksteel Mutation is an incredibly powerful spell in the right meta. It can completely shut a commander out of the game or reduce a creature to being just completely useless. But it has to be in the right meta. In some situations, it's just not going to be very, very good. You play against aristocrat players, you're going to be in a bad spot to be using this card. If you play against like another high-powered deck, like one of my friends plays Inala, like Darksteel Mutation does nothing against Inala, unfortunately. So there will always be kind of selections here that are more specific to the play group that this deck belongs in. So Some of the things I'm thinking of may not necessarily apply, but are worth considering. If in a deck like this, if it was in my play group, the cards that I would be worried about are things like going up against Esper Sentinel, going up against Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, uh, against like non-creature stacks decks or non-creature decks that like really benefit playing against non-creature decks, because you will be feeding them a lot of cards and paying a lot of mana into them. In addition, you don't really have what I would consider to be a particularly, how do I put this, strong defensive start. Let's see over here. Solitary Confinement is your strongest defensive spell for obvious reasons. It basically takes you out of the game for most things, not all things, but it does kind of lock you out of the like put you in a good defensive space against, you know, general aggression from your opponents. But I don't know if it's enough. Once again, it'll depend on your play group. But at this power level, I think you need to have one or two more options. Because at this power level, one of two things is going to happen. Either your opponents are going to be playing really aggressive strategies that could come down before solitary confinement goes off, or they're probably going to be playing really aggressive strategies that don't care about solitary confinement and don't actually mind if you cast this spell. So, for example, on the first end, we can think of really fast infinite combos involving like an infinite amount of creatures or a steady attack from more than one opponent. If I was playing, for example, I'm thinking of my Brina deck, which is close to a similar level of power mostly, and both Brina's kind of aggressive game plan could probably deal a large amount of damage to this deck because it just represents such big beaters so quickly, especially if I can get my opponents to help me out on that. But on the other hand, its combo win condition, Zulaport Cutthroat and Karmic Guide and I always forget the other one. Karmic Guide and anyways, infinite aristocrat triggers with Zulaport Cutthroat doesn't target, and therefore you will also lose even though you have solitary confinement out. That's not to even bring up the fact that other people with blue at this power level will most likely be playing their own Thassa's Oracle combos or their own Jace Wielder of Mysteries combos, both of which also ignore solitary confinement. So, with that in mind, though we have some like removal spells and some kind of wider removal spells here and there, where is it? I saw Grasp of Fate that gets each of your opponent's kind of cards. I do feel that you are a little behind in terms of early aggression against early aggression, and I don't know if I would play Ghostly Prison. I'm not going to necessarily say something like that, but it's something worth considering to kind of stem the tide. But that's going to be dependent on what you're up against. The other thing I'm going to point out before we go into the next topic, which I think is your finishers that we should talk about, but another thing I think is worth pointing out is your lack of removal. I think it's definitely worth playing a little more removal, even if we start off with Swords to Plowshares as just like, you know, your generic very strong white spell, um, or even, but much more importantly, I think I want you to at least play Beast Within, if not in addition to playing Generous Gift. And the reason for this is that there are certain cards that are just like really hard for you to play through, especially if protected. Namely, the two I'm thinking of that are from other stack style decks of Deafening Silence, which will stop you from casting multiple enchantments, or just plain Rule of Law, and its variants. These also come on creatures themselves. If anyone wanted to stop you, playing a few number of these cards would be probably more than enough to stop you, because you are a deck that like desperately wants to play multiple spells a turn. In fact, it's actually more than one of your win conditions. So being stopped that way is really kind of harmful for you because spending a turn to play an enchantress and not being able to, that's not actually an enchantress, hold on, playing an enchantress and then not being able to follow that up with an enchantment actually puts you rather far behind compared to other high powered decks. And so, yes, you do have O-ring effects that can get rid of these spells, but I think you struggle against a higher number of these spells, and you probably struggle to an extent that. So if I'm against you, right, and I'm playing, let's say, blue-white stacks or like some kind of controlish deck or aggressive deck that gets to play these rule of law effects, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play rule of law, or much more likely, I'll play deafening silence and I'll hold up like a counter spell for you. Because one of the things that's holding your deck back is almost all of your interaction outside of like managing to land Leyline of Anticipation is at sorcery speed. And because of that, I can basically hold up Dispel, let's just, not Dispel, sorry, just a counter spell with almost no cost because I know if I counter that one first spell that you use to try to take care of rule of law, I can counter it because you don't have anything at instant speed that can really deal with it. Like, don't get me wrong, Psych Rift is there, but otherwise, all of your other interaction is counter magic, which rule of law effects basically nullify. As long as I'm stopping the spell you're casting, you can't actually counter my spell, so I can hold you at bay for a really long time. That's the main reason I am suggesting playing something like Beast Within or Generous Gift is not just because they hit any type of permanent, but they operate at instant speed. And I think that allows you to get around some of these effects a lot easier because you can just use them on someone else's turn. And then even if they get countered, you still have the ability to O-ring on your own turn and get ahead that way. Because that kind of pressure will often get you out from under the rule of law effect. Whereas I think if you're depending on the fact that the first one works and then hoping to burn your opponent out on counter spells or protection spells over multiple turn cycles, I just don't think that's going to happen, right? If someone's playing like what I would consider generally good cards in addition to a rule of law effect, like Esper Sentinel, um, they're going to be gaining resources while you're attempting to deal with the card that stops you. And during that time, they're going to be able to get more cards to stop you from dealing with rule of law. That's those are like really specific things to worry about, but at this level of high powered commander decks, those are the things my mind goes to. All right. I have a few more suggestions in the instant speed section besides removal. I think you would really benefit from playing a few more tutors. Namely, I think Worldly Tutor and El Darami, is it? I know that's probably wrong. Eldrazi called. El, let's just do call. Go to E. That's a lot of C's. That does make sense. Eladamri's. There we go. Got it. Eladamri's call. Um, okay, so the reason I'm saying to go up on tutors, I don't think if we add more tutors, I don't think we're approaching CEDH. I think in a deck like this, we'd be approaching CEDH if we add fast mana, because right now you're still playing kind of turn by turn with the mana that can be provided from your enchantments, and therefore I think there is a limit of what you can get. And I also think Eladamri's, I'm gonna stutter on that one every time. Eladamri's and Worldly Tutor only grab you creatures, and so I feel like it's not like you are overpowering your deck by adding them. But all that aside, the reason I think they should be added is I think this deck wants a critical mass of these enchantment creatures, and I think you would very, very much benefit by having the ability to grab more enchantresses. Almost to the point that I'm also interested in telling you just to play, oh my goodness, Eternal Witness. Playing Eternal Witness. I know it's not one of the flashiest, and it's just like a classic, you know, in every green deck commander card. So I understand that it is not a fun card to be putting in, but some of your cards are pretty key, And I don't know you have what I would consider a large amount of ways to put them back, if any. I know you have Hall of Helioid's Generosity, but once again, at this power level, I expect that to be targeted if it's a problem, right? Like, for example, once again, at this power level, I am suggesting Beast Within, which is something I expect all your opponents to be playing if they have access to, right? Just like most of them will probably play Nature's Claim, as it is a 1 mana removal spell for all your enchantments. So Hall of Helioid Generosity is really, really cool, but it is not a universal fix to the problem of your cards being removed. There is the situation where should the key cards be removed at the key times and you're unable to play something that works similarly, you're going to be probably very behind and you might be losing the game because of it. So that's something that I think you could benefit from playing, grabbing. So then your tutor cards can also grab Ewit in addition to your enchantresses in order to in order for you to win the game or get ahead or deal with a problematic situation when you've been put into a bad spot. Now, of course, Ewit isn't as strong when you are using Rest in Peace. I think that's fair, but I think the opportunity cost of playing Ewit is incredibly low. That it's still worth it, even with Rest in Peace, which is an incredibly powerful card that you should try to get out every single game. I would argue having Ewit is still, I think, very much worth it. Then, are we going to go into? Yeah, all right. Let's talk about your game plans. So, without reading all of this out, our deck builder has 3 main game plans to winning the game. One is to do a Jace Wielder of the Mysteries combo by decking themselves, namely by playing Omniscience first, and then using that to constantly play enough cards to win with Jace's static ability by milling themselves out. Their secondary plan is to play Sigil of the Empty Throne and overwhelm their opponents with 4/4s. And the third one is to use Evasion and Tuvasa to just beat opponents down. Now, the way that they have cited Pemin's Aura being one of the strongest cards in the deck because it untaps an enchanted the creature that this enchantment is on, and it gives flying. They are both noting it as an ability to get Tuvasa to have, a certain sort of unblockability, and in addition, to use on something like Sanctum Weaver to make an infinite amount of mana. So before we go any further, I want to briefly suggest that we should be playing both copies of this card with Freed from the Real. I don't think there is a third version of this card that does this, but I could be wrong. Freed from the Real untaps Enchanted Creature, which is really just what you want, on Sanctum Weaver, and able to get infinite mana. I believe the main game plan win situation should not be about the finishers, but should be generally about putting Freed from the Real onto Sanctum Weaver. That already generates 2 mana. If you have an additional enchantment, you can do it basically neutral. And then with the 4th enchantment, because Sanctum Weaver itself is an enchantment, you now have infinite mana. So I think the main game plan should be more so to get Freed from the Real or Penman's Aura, which, when I look at it, Penman's is only 1 blue, so definitely stronger of the two. But either way, if you can attach these spells onto Sanctum Weaver and have it so it's mana positive, then you're probably going to win the game. Because if nothing else, you could at least cast your commander and then at least have 1 enchantress moving forward for the turn. Though I'm saying that and I'm remembering that Tuvasa only triggers on the first enchantment spell, so perhaps that maybe that line doesn't work as well as I think. But I would just argue that the harder part isn't casting the Omniscience, it's getting the mana to do so. So, moving back, Freed from the Real, I think is a nice inclusion to kind of increase the chances of being able to get Sanctum Weaver. And then you have multiple tutors for both half of that You have Tutors that both grab the Freed from the Real, Pendants, Aura, Omniscience, those cards. And you have the creature tutors to grab Sanctum Weaver to ensure that you can start going off. I guess if you really wanted to, the next step would be like a haste enabler, but I don't think that the deck necessarily needs that. I think you're pretty happy playing Sanctum Weaver at all, and your opponents are going to just treat that generally as a very, very strong card, regardless of if it's an infinite combo or not. And if they can deal with it, they will, and if they can't, they won't. That unfortunately is probably going to be the situation there. If you wanted to further protect that combo, I guess the next step would be to looking into any aura that gives Hex Proof, which they're not great. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I would say either of these would probably be very, very fine. Getting your creature ahead, both of them have flash. I think that's fine. But I don't necessarily know if that's the direction I want. I wonder instead, I'd rather the phase out instant. Phase out 1 blue, which is sneak out the back, I believe. Slip out the back. That's another option to protect that creature. Anyways, let's go back with that in mind, that we can kind of upgrade the ability to make mana. Let's look at our game plans again. So I'm going to suggest that maybe this is just me, but I think the Sigil of the Empty Throne direction is probably the weaker of the three. Now, the reason I feel this way is because it has the most hoops to jump through, and though it's not that many more hoops than the others, like all the first two strategies, in fact, all three strategies are really strong because they follow the deck's primary plan of playing enchantments. All of them benefit from that. I do like that. However, Omniscience is a really interesting card to make as a part of a combo because, frankly, Omniscience is just a combo card by itself. If you can resolve Omniscience, you just probably win the game anyways. So I'm not too worried about, you play Omniscience and nothing happens. Something has to gone really, really wrong for you to, like, if you play Omniscience and then your opponent casts Silence in response, well, yeah, okay, I guess you don't win the game, even if you resolve Omniscience. But outside of that, I think you're pretty fine generally. Um, Ranger Captain of Eos is another thing I think this deck might be susceptible to in that way. But anyways, if you manage to resolve Omniscience, you're probably going to be okay. You're probably going to win the game. However, that doesn't really apply for Sigil of the Empty Throne, right? Resolving Sigil of Empty Throne requires 1, 5 mana, which is a lot, and 2, then another spell for it to do anything. Technically, Omniscience has that same qualifier where you technically need a second spell in hand for Omniscience to be good, but no, right? Like, Omniscience just has such a high ceiling of power and represents so much, whereas Sigil of the Empty Throne is just a 4/4 angel, right? Like, no matter, even if you do only get one cast out of it, Omniscience's ability to save all the mana you would have had, to use that to cast that spell, well, like, that's a huge advantage there. Whereas just getting that one spell and getting a 4/4 angel creature token, I don't know. I don't think a lot of decks at this power level are particularly afraid of that ability. And so I would maybe suggest that their power level shouldn't be this comparable. You can probably keep Sigil of the Empty Throne, but I don't know if I would cite it as one of your main ways to win, right? Like, it feels like not the main. It shouldn't be the secondary plan. It should be at least the tertiary or beyond. And like, even if the secondary plan is just adding Thassa's Oracle in addition to Jace Wielder of Mysteries, like, that's still a direction that I think is worth considering. This is kind of the deck that, like, you know, in Bant, there's not a lot of really good options to immediately win the game, but beating down with 5/5s, I don't know if that's exactly it, right? I think like you could be looping, taking other turn spells. You could be looping spells that allow you to brain freeze your opponents. I'm not really sure what is the next natural step because, frankly, Sigil, like, partially, I think the idea of using Cetacean's Champion or Tuvasa to get incredibly strong. Oh, I know what the other win condition is. Sorry, I had thought of it earlier and I forgot to say it. But beating down is also probably not the next step. What I am going to say, Helm of, I believe it's Obedience. Helm of Obedience should be your secondary win condition outside of the Omniscience one. Now it's secondary because it is not going to defeat all your opponents. It's going to defeat them one at a time, but I believe it's considerably more functional than beating down with 4/4s. Helm of Obedience is a 4 mana artifact that you have to pay 1 and tap. X can't be 0. And then you're going to target an opponent and you're going to mill them until whatever X is, X number of cards go into the graveyard. With Rest in Peace, this is a immediate, I guess, player destruction spell because you exile their entire deck. They go to their upkeep. Since their deck is exiled, they actually don't have a really meaningful way to interact with like on the stack or anything. They can't put cards back into their deck or anything. They're out of the game. That's it. It's good. It only takes out one player at a time, but it is, I think, much more reliable than the other combo because you already want to be playing Rest in Peace almost every game, and Helm of Obedience also is very, very functional um, to mill someone out completely with infinite mana. Granted, you then lose the Helm of Obedience because you have to reanimate. Let me read this. I've never read the second the second ability. Right, you know, you can't mill someone out with infinite mana because the first creature goes in. Okay, so it has to work with Rest in Peace. Sorry, I've never seen this card without the context that it defeats someone with Rest in Peace, so I've never really bothered to read it. So with that in mind, I think that would be good as a secondary win condition. I think you should probably keep Sigil of the Empty Throne, but you should treat it as your tertiary win condition. Now, you can tutor for Sigil and you can't tutor for Helm of Obedience, so there is a bit of a loss there. But the fact that it can completely get around, combat as a whole is more the idea that I like about it. I think this deck does not excel at combat. I think you are already enough of a threat with the amount of permanence you put on play that you producing an army will probably just get you killed. Like, I maybe I could be wrong about this, and depending on your play group, but with a deck at this power level, with the consistency that it has by having so much pseudo cycling and so much after the second Enchantress card draw and card advantage, I am really wary to leave this deck by itself. It is susceptible early game because you haven't put fast mana in it, and I think that's fine. Um, and therefore it is very susceptible to being knocked out of the game with significant pressure. With that in mind, playing another card that promises further, further board advantage over the next few turns for lethal swings only further attracts attention of your opponents to take out. You're also like in a really nice place where board clears are particularly ineffective against you, and to then play all of these angels which immediately turn on your opponent's board clears, which even at this power level they probably don't play many, but they play enough. It's kind of a tough position to be in. All right, let me see how we are on time. Okay, I'm probably going to be wrapping this up. Now, I want to be clear. I haven't suggested a lot of cards because I think the deck is really, really strong. And I think when decks are this level of powerful, like it's really hard to kind of make meaningful suggestions that don't functionally like weaken the deck. And I think that's a good thing. I think this deck is in a really, really strong place. And all of my suggestions are places that I think the deck is somewhat weak in and is susceptible to. Now, some of these things, there'll be no fixing, right? Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, just does a ton of work against this deck. This deck's main problem that it's going to be held back is mana. You can, if you are doing what you mean to do, and if you're working well, the deck is working well, you will be drawing so many cards. What you will not be doing is creating infinite mana outside of your main combo. And because of that, cards like Thalia, cards like Thorn of Amethyst, cards that increase the mana cost of non-creature spells are very expensive for you to deal with. Because not only do you not have a lot of good options that aren't non-creature spells, the ones you do are dependent on non-creature spells, and then your removal is also non-creature spells. So it's a little tough for you to be in that situation because you're going to be on the backswing the whole time. In the same way that a card like Esper Sentinel is particularly strong against you always. And that's fine. It's a strong card. It's fine to be susceptible to a card like that. Hence why I think a little more permanent in creature removal, and maybe one or two tutors to increase your consistency is probably the best direction to go into. Whether or not you want to play Helm of Obedience, that doesn't really matter as much. I think the bigger change you will have is on your proactive and defensive sides of being able to proactively build your combo faster and defensively protect your combo from key pieces that you need to remove that they themselves are resistant to your regular kinds of removal. Once again, I'm thinking rule of law creatures and the like. And then, once again, the only card that I say you should absolutely play is Free from the Real, because it just functions as another way for you to gain infinite mana. I would really, really love to see the next draft of this deck. I think it's really good. And, this is really close to what I would consider a completed deck. As I've said before, I would like to very much so build a collection of completed decks, and I think this would be considered almost done to be a Tuvasa high power commander deck. So if anyone ever wants to build Tuvasa at a high power, we can just cite this deck as a really, really strong example of that. And I think my suggestions would improve it. I'd love to hear back from you because at this point of the power level of the deck is so high and the deck is so good that I want to hear your opinions on what I have cited. And then if we're in agreement, we might be ready for a final draft. I hope this was helpful. I'd love to see the next draft of this deck and any other deck you might have. And there is a form within the video description below for you, the deck builder, or anyone else who is watching to submit their decks towards me. If you have an argument for maybe playing Sithis, a Sithis enchantment deck that you think will just be better because Sithis has a higher ceiling than Tuvasa, I would love to see it. Maybe we can compare the two or think about the benefits of Sithis while losing a color. What are the detriments there? Either way, I would also appreciate if you like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube thing. It's always good for the channel. And I wish you luck in finalizing this deck. I think it is really, really fun, and I'm very impressed by it. All right, good luck.